name's Patty Poss. I'm with the Kensington Historical Society, and we are here tonight for From Corn to Commuters. This is all about the history of the Metropolitan Railroad, the B&O Railroad that came through Kensington 150 years ago. And Susan will correct me when I have something wrong here, but we're so glad you joined us. So our speaker tonight is Susan Cooke Soderberg of the Germantown Historical Society. Probably many of you already know who she is. She's famous in the area for all of her historical work. Ms. Soderberg will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take some questions, hopefully from those in the room and those on Zoom. So those of you who are on Zoom, you can go ahead and put the questions that you have in the chat. I'll bring those up to Susan, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Thanks so much for your patience. If you have any trouble hearing, we'll try to make sure we repeat the questions so that those at home can also hear. So this event is sponsored, as I said, by the Kensington Historical Society, and we hope that you'll join us as a member. There's membership forms on the back table. And of course, if you have not seen, there are so many events going on in recognition of the 150th anniversary. We have these beautiful display boards in the back if you hadn't had a chance to look at them. We have tonight's event, and I have to tell you about the May 28th event, Toasting the Met at the Baby Cat Brewery, which is a terrific, fun place here in Kensington that's new. There's flyers about that there. And on Monday, there's an excursion train trip, which I have heard is sold out. So that's terrific, but there's also kind of a party at the train station, so even if you're not riding, come on down. And there's much more. If you go to the Kensington Historical website, you'll see all of the lists and activities that are happening in honor of the 150th. Well, we are honored tonight to have Susan Cooke Soderberg to be our guest speaker on this topic. Ms. Soderberg is a public historian and a freelance writer living in Germantown. Now, I had to look up what a public historian was. I'd never heard that term, and maybe you'll share more of us, but it says, well, some of the sources, there actually looks like there's some conflicting definitions, but a focus on history for the general public, rather than academics or specialists. Wow, is that wonderful? So great to have you, and what a terrific thing you do. You've had a long career of writing and lecturing and sharing information about the public history in Maryland. She holds a BA in art history and a master's degree in American Studies from George Washington University. She worked almost 20 years with the Montgomery County Park and Planning Commission and has spent many years writing and lecturing and presentations on a whole lot of topics. The first one that I saw online was about the history of Maryland's emancipation, and that's how I first learned who you were. But so many things about the Civil War and the history of Germantown, of course, and just an impressive list of topics. And of course, a book, which some of you have already purchased, on the history of the Metropolitan branch of the B&O Railroad. She's a well-known historian, and Montgomery Preservation has awarded her the Montgomery Prize for more than 3 decades of contributions to the local and state history. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you get the best part of the evening, and I'll turn it over to you, Susan Cooke Soderberg. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm talking to you about the MARC. As a lot of you know it, the MARC train. This is 150 years ago it was founded, and it changed Montgomery County forever. So let's look first. First I'm going to show you a little background on the Metropolitan Branch Railroad. The railroad was the first dirt was dug on July 4th, 1828, the same day that the C&O Canal was begun. And it took quite a while to go from Baltimore to Wheeling, West Virginia, to the Ohio River, but they got there eventually in 1853. So like the first National Road West, which is Route 40, it was sponsored by the merchants and manufacturers and bankers of Baltimore. They were building factories in Baltimore now using the new steam engines. They needed a way to get raw materials from the West into their factories and then to export finished goods and imported items back to the West. They needed three things. They needed the invention of the steam engine that replaced horses pulling wagons along rails. They needed a good source of iron for the rails, which they found in West Virginia. And they needed manpower, which came in the port of Baltimore in the way of immigrants. So you can see here on the top is the old main line going from Baltimore west. And as soon as that was built, they found they built a new line going from that one down to Washington, D.C., with a spur going here out to the port of Annapolis. So they had a station in Washington, D.C. at 2nd and Pennsylvania Avenue. Then they built another one at 6th and Constitution. And finally, in 1850, they built a substantial, lovely Italianate-style station in New Jersey Avenue. Later, they wanted to combine all the trains that were coming into Washington into one station and put the tracks underground so they wouldn't keep running into people. So they built Union Station. That was 1905. But you see what's missing here? What's missing is the hypotenuse of the triangle. So entrepreneurs and farmers in Montgomery County saw that, and they decided they would ask B&O to build it first. B&O refused because they didn't have the money and they had striking workers, and they were still building their line west. So here we have the mastermind, Francis Cassatt Clapper. He had a farm in between Gaithersburg and Germantown, and he made bricks on that farm. He had a grist mill and a fulling mill, and he wanted to sell his products in Washington and make money. So he got together with some other local people. Unfortunately, Mr. Clapper died in 1868. So he died before this line was finished 150 years ago. So then he needed to get the charter passed by the state legislature, and here's that man, William Lincoln Gaither. He was a Maryland state representative in the state, and then a state senator for 20 years. Gaithersburg, by the way, is not named for him. It's named for his second cousin, and Benjamin Gaither, who owned a property where Forest Oak stood. Gaithersburg was first known as Logtown, then Forest Oak, and then finally Gaithersburg. And then they needed money, so they approached this guy, William Wilson Corcoran. He was a millionaire, philanthropist, political lobbyist. He had a lot of influence and a lot of money. So they created this Metropolitan Railroad Company. Whoops. Got ahead of myself here. So they got a lot of local people to come in with them, but they could not build it. They had the survey done, they started to break ground for the rails, but they ran out of money. So they had to give up their charter. This was their original plan from the surveys that were done in 1854. But then the Civil War came. So that really clinched the deal. They couldn't build it after that. But the Civil War itself did prove that trains were worthwhile. It was worth your money to build train tracks. So B&O, after the war, took over the charter of the old Metropolitan Railroad Company. John W. Garrett saw the value of the railroads. And he also had pressure from Pennsylvania, a railroad company that was vying to build railroad lines into Maryland. And he also saw that with the increased traffic, there are 2 tunnels on the old main line, and so they really needed to build a new railroad. And he saw this as a great investment. He started life as an investment banker and a merchant, so he knew the value of money, and money was his bottom line. So he had actually guided the B&O through the Civil War by building prefabricated bridges and railroads structures that could replace the ones that the Confederates destroyed during the war very quickly. So he was a pretty smart guy. So this shows the new railroad line on the right and the old one on the left. The new survey goes not to Georgetown like the Metropolitan Branch did, but it goes to the center of Washington. It also doesn't go to Frederick or up to Hagerstown like that first line did, but it stops, joins the old main line at Point of Rocks. So it was straighter and it was more economical. But it was still very difficult to build. You can see here the challenges that the engineers and contractors had building this railroad, going from Washington up 500 feet to Gaithersburg and then down again where the Monocacy River comes in and then up again at Pars Ridge. So they had to cross these 5 major waterways. And they did it various ways. This was their biggest challenge, the Monocacy River, where they built a viaduct with a Bowman deck truss. Later on, that was replaced. Also interesting was this trestle at Little Seneca Creek, which was a pretty small waterway, but it had a very deep gorge. So that was curving trestle, which was very unique. People often forget about the culverts. If we didn't have the culverts under the railroad tracks, water would come in from these little creeks whenever it rained and flood the railroads. So they were very important. This particular one, you could see me with my old dog there. You could see how large it is. So this was built by a very familiar name, and that is Mr. Boyd. James Alexander Boyd was from Scotland, and he was a master stonemason. These culverts were built without any mortar. He was also an engineer, but he was also a farmer. And he had the contract to build the railroad from Gaithersburg to Pars Ridge, which is the other side of Barnesville. Just one more fact about this. So the first dirt was dug at Pars Ridge on Tuesday, April 17th, 1866. And James Boyd was there, and a lot of people were gathered around for this groundbreaking for the new railroad. It was covered by the Montgomery County Sentinel, and the reporter of the Sentinel, who did not put his name on the byline, he was a great prophet of what was going to happen. This is what he said. Not only will our people be enabled to retrieve their losses occasioned by the late war, but such an influx of population, such a rapid development of the resources of our county will follow, and such a spirit of enterprise will be awakened by the construction of this road, that our barren fields will be converted into blooming gardens as if by magic, which is what happened. So this is the railroad when it was built, after it was built, about 1890. The last rail was laid in Gaithersburg, February 8, 1873, and the first trains ran on the track from D.C. up to Point of Rocks in the old main line on May 25, 1873. The cost of this railroad was $3.5 million, which in today's money would be about $76 million. The fare, interesting enough, in those days was $1.10, which translates today to $28. But the fare, round trip, is only $14. So we made it under the inflation rate there. Soon after it was built, the old main line became practically obsolete, and the trains from Baltimore went down to Washington first and then west. You can see how that hypotenuse has been built into the triangle. The Capitol Dome logo that you see here on the top of the screen became a symbol of the B&O Railroad. The first logo on the left is 1880. The second one is the 1890s, and then by the 1930s they got rid of the banner and the slogan, but the dome and the colors, dark blue and gray, were still there. So just a little side about the Georgetown branch. Late in the 1880s, the B&O Railroad devised a plan to connect Metropolitan Branch with the new Alexandria branch in Virginia. But there were a lot of stumbling blocks. They had 3 corporations to form for 3 different political jurisdictions. So the Georgetown branch was not completed to Virginia. So it only went from Bethesda down to the Falls, but it was finally completed to Georgetown in 1910, but it only carried freight. It was a single track and it only carried freight back and forth. It was abandoned in 1987 and is now the Capitol Crescent Trail for hiking and biking. So, modernization had to come to the railroad as the years went by and things started getting old and wearing down. The Bowman Truss Bridge over the Monocacy was changed into a single track there. A span. 1906 to 1908, sections between Gaithersburg and Germantown and Barnesville to Dickerson were double-tracked. Actually, in the 1890s, it was double-tracked from Washington, D.C. to Gaithersburg. The Gaithersburg to Boyd section was not completed until 1927. What held it up? It was that berm that had to be built over Little Seneca Creek. That took many years. They built this Waring Viaduct and the Monocacy Viaduct, which are identical, in about 1906 and 1908. But that filling in the big gully formed by Little Seneca Creek took much longer. So between Gaithersburg and Boyd's, there was only a single track. So how did they keep the trains from running into each other? They had a telegraph tower at each end, and the telegraph operators would tell the trains when they can go and when they had to stop and wait. And they had a siding there where they could wait. And these telegraph towers were guarded by U.S. troops during World War I because they were very important. What did they do when the telegraph didn't work, the lines were cut or something like that? The conductors had a baton, the old-fashioned way. It's a piece of wood painted red or orange, and they would pass that baton to the next, to the conductor of the train coming the other way. So then they would know they could go on the single track. Modernization also included safety measures for pedestrians, cars, and horse and wagons, and later cars. So we had these underpasses and overpasses built. That was between 1886 and 1912. So we also had these block towers that you see, that one to the right of the Point of Rock station, and the QN tower at Washington, D.C. These block towers had interlocking machines with levers, sets of levers with electronic contacts. They would control the signals and control the changing of the tracks. The agents would communicate first by telegraph, then by telephone, then by radio. There is I don't think you can see it, but there's a little wire that you can see connecting the block tower right here to the telephone pole. Now all the signals are operated from Jacksonville, Florida. There's only one block tower left, and it's at Brunswick. Those of you who are riding the train on Monday will be able to see that because it has been moved from next to the station into the park, just across the tracks. That was quite recent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the station houses now, of which you have a beautiful one here in Kensington. The person who designed these stations, buildings, is this man, Ephraim Francis Baldwin. He played a significant role in architectural development of the B&O Railroad and Baltimore and of the Catholic Church. By the time of his death in 1916, one could have walked on Charles Street in Baltimore from Baltimore Street to Franklin Street and been only a few yards from one of his buildings. He designed over 500 buildings, and 100 of these are still standing in a variety of styles. He was very prolific, but he was also ingenious, and he could work in practically any architectural style. Italianate, Romanesque, stick, Queen Anne, Eastlake, neoclassical. He often would design the railroad stations, as you'll see, to complement the community that they're in. According to architectural historian Michael Lewis, Baldwin's railroad stations, though straightforward and practical, never hardened into one route or routine. He constantly adjusted its architectural language, updating in accordance with the changing fashion. He never had a degree in architecture. Why? Because no colleges offered degrees in those days. The first college to offer a degree in architecture was MIT in 1868. So he apprenticed. He was very lucky to get an apprenticeship with John Nairnsey and James Nielsen because they were one of the most prestigious firms in Baltimore. After he finished his apprenticeship, he first partnered with his fellow apprentice, Bruce Price, but that was not a very happy union, and it only lasted 4 years. So his longest and most productive partnership was with Josias Pennington from 1873 to 1916. That's 43 years they were partners. I also wanted to mention that Francis Baldwin was a devout Catholic, and his family was devout as well. He had 9 children, 7 boys and 2 girls, and that's why he was hired by the Diocese of Baltimore, the first diocese in the country, to build the buildings at Catholic University. Yes, and he built a lot of other buildings around the area for the Catholic Church as well. And this partner of his, Josias Pennington, was also Catholic because he had the name Josias with an S instead of an H. Josias was a biblical figure in the Old Bible, and in the King James Version it was changed to Josiah. So in 1871, he was elected to the American Institute of Architecture, and it's interesting to note that a fellow member was William Rich Hutton from Clopper. He was the son-in-law of Francis Cassatt Clopper. So let's look at this famous railroad station. Because he was worked for the B&O, Baltimore, and the Catholic Diocese of Baltimore, he just was only known locally until recently when this train station was chosen as one of 4 in the whole nation to be on postage stamps that were put out this past April. So this is the Point of Rock station. It was interesting. It was a large station which had the station master's quarters upstairs, which meant it had plumbing and electricity, which meant that the ladies' waiting room could have a ladies' restroom downstairs, which was quite unusual for the train stations that were built in the 1880s and 90s. It was struck by lightning in 1931, but it was restored by the B&O. And it closed in 1962 as a train station, but it now houses offices, and it is on the National Register. As we go through these pictures of these train stations, everyone with an asterisk by the name under the picture is on the National Register of Historic Places. So the first stations that were built on the line were these two, Rockville and Silver Spring, which are mirror images of each other. The other thing is that the stations' pictures with the gold frame are still with us. The ones without a frame are gone. They're in the Victorian Gothic style with Eastlake detailing in the woodwork and gables. However, they were going to tear it down, the Rockville station, when the metro was built, and they had to move the tracks over. However, a fledgling Peerless Rockville and Rockville Historic District Commission brought the station's plight to the attention of the city and the metro, ultimately helping to negotiate a compromise. The station and its freight house would not be demolished, but relocated just a few feet away, so the buildings could be restored and the preservation-friendly buyer found while allowing Metro to proceed. In 1981, the 400-ton station was carefully lifted off its foundation and moved about 30 feet to the south and reoriented 180 degrees, so the building now faces Church Street. Today, the station is the home of the law firm Gill and Sipple, and they remain committed to preserving this landmark in Rockville's history. The Silver Spring station was destroyed in 1944 to make way for a new modern station to be built. Also, these two early stations, Gaithersburg and Boyd's, they were built of substantial brick. They were part of a set of stations that were built for the B&O Railroad in the 1880s. The original drawings for the Gaithersburg station are at the B&O Railroad Museum, and I mention this because the B&O Railroad headquarters was burned in the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904, and a lot of Baldwin's drawings were destroyed. So it's lucky that these were saved. The Gaithersburg station is a matching freight house, now housing the Gaithersburg Community Museum, which was built at the same time, but it had been enlarged a little bit in 1904. The office in the center with identical waiting rooms on either side, elaborate brick dental work, and a massive tower in the middle. So on the left, then we have the Boyd station, which is unfortunately no longer with us, but we do have the original drawings for that as well, housed at the Smithsonian. So a very distinctive octagonal tower on the Boyd station and other decorative elements. The waiting room on this station was on one side and the baggage or room on the other. It was demolished in 1927 in order to make way for the double tracking. And then we have these 5 stations, one of which is Kensington's, that were almost identical. Kensington and Dickerson are still with us. They're a little bit different because Dickerson, if you'll look closely, has a triangular, a triangular ticket agent's office right there. Yeah. The Kensington and Woodside have the extended open bay for freight that was built on the side. The Germantown station burned by arson on January 25th, 1978, and it was rebuilt by Montgomery County from the original design drawings from the B&O Railroad Museum. Now, I want you to look at these closely and look at where the chimneys are, because if you see two chimneys like on Gaithersburg, you know that there were two waiting rooms because the baggage room wouldn't have been heated. So if you have two pipes coming up or two chimneys coming up, you'll know that there were two waiting rooms, and they were for men and for women. These are very unique stations that were designed by Baldwin. The Tacoma Park station is kind of Bavarian and rustic to fit in with the Eastland stick style of the community, Tacoma Park. And this also has original drawings at the Smithsonian. The thing to note about the Tacoma Park station is that little conical hat it has on the top, and also the dormers on either side, which are fake. There's no second story. So the road next to it was lowered to make an underpass for the railroad in 1912, but it unfortunately was burned by arson on December 1st, 1967. The university station is very unique because it's built of stone, and that was dictated by the Catholic Church. This little station serves Catholic University, or did serve when it was there. It was commissioned by the Catholic Diocese for that it must be built of the same Georgetown bluestone as Caldwell Hall, which was also designed by Baldwin. It's a Richardson Romanesque style, and that little porch-like piece in the front is called a porte cochere for to drive your car under so you wouldn't get wet, or the taxi. It was torn down in the 1970s to make way for Metro. Now, these little stations were placed at the smaller train stops and they were very nice little stations, though. Well, board and batten with metal roofs, but look at the whimsical finials on the rooftop and the corners, and the scroll work on the barge boards that's on the end. That's called jigsaw gingerbread. So you can tell that it has a baggage room on one side and a waiting room on the other because of the smokestack for the stove, which sticks out of one side. But also you have a big door on the left and a little door on the right. Now there was a station that was not designed by, oh, wait a minute, we got these little designs that were created for the milk delivery. The farmers would put their big milk cans on this platform, which was built right up against the tracks so that they could load the milk cans directly onto the cars. And now, without the bottom part, they're used as stations, or shelters, open shelters for the passengers waiting for the train. And you'll see them at Germantown and at Garrett Park. They also had designed their own outhouses, which were used by most of the people because most of the stations did not have indoor plumbing. Only the big ones did. So this is the station that was not designed by Baldwin. The architect was Alphonse Henry Byler. He was partnered with Baldwin and Pennington from 1883 to 1893. It's very unique because of its circular tower, and on top of that tower is a little bell-shaped dome, which you don't see on any of Baldwin's designs. Also, the tower has curved windows. Very difficult to create in those days, and those cute little eyebrow dormers. a crested finial along the top of the roof. This was put into forest land before the National Park Seminary. It was when we had the forest in there. So it was made to look like that forest inn. Now the little waiting station that you see there was built before the double tracking, and when they double tracked it, they put a track on either side of that waiting station, which made it very, very precarious, especially with its glass windows, so it probably was moved soon after that. There was a foot tunnel built under the tracks after the National Park Cemetery was built, so that the girls wouldn't get hit by a train. So now we get to the gist of my talk, how the Metropolitan Ranch Railroad changed Montgomery County. In the upper part of Montgomery County, you have new towns popping up, which were agricultural railroad stops, many of them to load milk or other agricultural products. So these Boyd's was originally James Boyd's work construction camp, and he bought that land and turned it into a farm after the railroad was completed. Dickerson was something like Boyd's, but that was Mr. Dickerson built a store at the railroad camp when they continued with the store after the railroad was built, and a little town grew up around there. Where you see just below Germantown is Waring. That was a milk stock, but it was also where the steam train stopped to load water. They pumped water up from the Great Seneca Creek to the top to fill the steam engines. They had to stop every several miles to load more water. So it changed the construction. It grew new towns, but also it made some towns move. Germantown was 1 mile to the west, and so the whole commercial center of Germantown moved 1 mile to the east to be next to the railroad tracks. This very dramatic little map. The same thing happened to Barnesville. But that new town, which grew up about a mile southwest of Barnesville, was called Salmons. And people would come up from the cities to spend vacation in the country, and so we had hotels growing up in the up county, like this Burdette Hotel, Highview in Boyd's. And in just south of Gaithersburg, there was a Methodist camp meeting. The Methodists saw their opportunity and snatched up the land in the end of 1863 and built this camp meeting, which was a religious assembly, like a Chautauqua. It had summer cottages. They built a meeting hall and a dining hall. The general store, however, was on the other side of the tracks because they sold tobacco. Yeah. So they ended the assemblies in 1924, but the houses stayed and were winterized, and it was incorporated as a town in 1937. Now, this little station was not a Baldwin station. It was built later in the 20th century, but you can see that the two chimneys, massive chimneys on the stop, had men and women waiting rooms, but at this point in time, in the 20th century, they may also have had plumbing and restrooms inside. So this is a picture of what agriculture looked like before the train. Farmers grew wheat, they grew tobacco, they grew corn and potatoes. The grist mills that ground the wheat and the corn were located next to creeks. So they could take advantage of the water power. And then this is a picture of agriculture after. We still have the apple and the peach tree orchards, and also the beehives, because you need bees to pollinate the fruit trees. Then you had more than 500 dairy farms in the Up County. On the lower left is a Paclamar astronaut. A bunch of farmers got together and bought this scrawny little bull calf at the Montgomery Fair and sent him off to Indiana. And there he grew big, and he became such a prolific father of his semen is still sold today. He has thousands of cows because his cows were so prolific with their milk and gave such good milk. And we have the King Barn Dairy Museum in Germantown, which tells the story of all of these dairy farms in Montgomery County, of which there is only one left. The mills moved next to the railroad tracks and took advantage of that steam power so that they could grind the corn and the wheat and barley and ship that right into the city. Also, there was an industry of buying up the spent cows and shipping them off. That was the job of Mr. Herman Rabbit, who was a very eccentric character in Montgomery County. Down county, you had industry coming up in mid-county. Thomas Cannery in Gaithersburg. And of course, a lot of building was going on, so you had lumber yards, you had coal yards to feed the new residents' stoves. And you also had mercantile businesses, all kinds of stores that were built along the railroad tracks to bring in the new produce that was available. With the railroad, you can even buy oysters, fresh. And then we had the railroad suburbs, and we are sitting in one of those. These are the advertisements that were on the trains and handed out to people that would get them to come in to buy lots and build houses in these new communities. So you see here some of these new communities, Tacoma Park, Silver Spring, and then Woodside, Linden, Forest Glen, Capitol View, and Kensington. These were the first one was Linden, actually, in 1873. Charles Keyes subdivided 32 acres of his farm into lots of Linden. The next one was Tacoma Park with Benjamin Franklin Gilbert that purchased 90 acres and laid out lots. In 1886, Garrett Park was laid out by Henry Kopp. And in 1887, Forest Glen Investment Company, and that was had a big hotel, and then we have Capitol View in 1887. Marion Oliver Haar purchased and subdivided that land and named it for the Capitol Dome, which could be seen, at least in the winter, from that height. Woodside was the next one by the dean of the Howard Law School, Benjamin Layton. And then finally, in 1890, Kensington, named as Knoll Stations by Brainerd Warner, purchased and subdivided the land and established the summer homes there. And further up the track, we had Randolph. Montrose was named then for this development at Montrose was named Randolph after James Randolph, who was one of the engineers designing the railroad bridges. Westmore and Rockville, Lincoln Park was founded to serve the African American people, and then Durwood was already a village there, but it became known as the Durwood Dip by the railroad people because there's a little dip there at Krebsbrand, and it was also marked the halfway point on the railroad line. Some of these houses built by the people in Washington who used them first as summer houses, or where the family lived while the father was working during the week down in the city. Some of them were big and fancy like these. in a variety of styles. They had double lots so that they could also have gardens and stables. So this slide will show you how the development went along Silver Spring. Francis Preston Blair, who owned the farm called Silver Spring, was an influential person in Washington, D.C. during Lincoln's administration, and he was influential in getting the railroad to build through his farm rather than through the old Metropolitan Railroad Company's first survey. And it became a central station because of the access to the trolley and to the roads. But it didn't really take off as a big business district until after World War II with Blair Lee, grandson of Francis Preston Blair. So you can see how it grew up here. This is it's taken from the very same spot. The 1945 station that you see on the right in the second picture, that is a station that's still there today. So we have the B&O Railroad now is owned by CSX Transportation, at least the tracks are, and we run MARC on it, Maryland Area Rail Commuter, and the Amtrak Capital Limited train goes to Chicago every day along this track. Today, the freight trains are longer, sometimes up to 2 miles long. So, yes, so you have to make way, these little commuter trains have to make way for those big, long freight trains. So here is the end of my talk, and you can see 3 books that I recommend. And one of them, of course, is my book, which you can buy back there from Kate. So I'm open for questions.
Well, you didn't say, mention terracotta, even though terracotta was on your chart. What was terracotta?
Oh, wait, Mr. Dedham, can you wait and ask your question into the microphone?
Well, his question was about terracotta. Terracotta was a station that was inside Washington, D.C., and I can tell you a long story about terracotta. But it was the terracotta company that made clay pipes for water, usually, as well as some other kinds of terracotta or clay materials for. But it had a little station, actually, the Kensington station. One of the stations had a waiting shelter. But when their station was built, was moved to terracotta. And it was at that terracotta station that one of the worst train wrecks in the history of trains happened in 1906, when, and between Christmas and New Year's, people were coming back from vacations, and when three cars loaded up with people and a deadhead, that's a train without any people on it, came and hit it from the back and split it just in half. The back car, the first car was split in half, the second one was smooshed up, and the third one was damaged, but so many people died that they forbid any more building of wood train cars. They also improved the signal system. Any other questions, or do we have some from the virtual audience?
This very thing. There's over about Peace Cross there was a port for ships going out to sea. Did they consider running a train over to, is that Bladensburg?
Yes.
Okay, that was never considered.
From Gaithersburg to Laurel, they were going to build one, but then they ran out of money. And now we have the inter-county connector. So.
For those who are on Zoom, if you want to type yours into the chat, now we'll all see it, but please feel free to type it into the chat if you have a question. Anybody else in the room have a question? Yes.
I'm just wondering, is the Rock Creek overpass still there, or where was it located?
It was filled in, right. The one on the Capitol Crescent Trail is there, though?
Just taking down.
Yeah, it's been replaced. They built a new one next to it for the trail, yeah. But they're parallel, the trail and the rail and the new purple line.
We're having trouble with the mic, so if you want to ask your questions, sir, ask it real loud.
I just wondered what was the actual location of the terracotta station. I've heard the history, but I don't know where it was.
You know where the line is separating Montgomery County from Washington, D.C., and there's Blair Road? It was just below that on the east side of the tracks. Any other questions?
Why were there separate waiting rooms for men and women, especially if they were traveling together?
Why were separate waiting rooms for men and women? Well, the women were, if they had their own restroom. So they didn't want to use the outhouse because of their long dresses, and so they had a separate restroom. And if the station house had plumbing, then they had a nice water running restroom inside. Yeah, so they wanted to be separate for that reason. Now that brings another question, which I always get, but I'll ask my own question, and unless you had one, Kate? Oh.
One other reason I think for the separate men's waiting room is because they smoked.
Oh, right, yes, thanks for adding that,
cigars.
yes.
And the women didn't want the smoke.
Didn't want the smell of smoke on their dresses. So some people have suggested that the separate waiting rooms were for African Americans and women, and there were separate. They were not allowed to combine. This is actually from Maryland laws, effective July 1st, 1904. Railroads and steamship lines in Maryland, except those that passed through without stopping, had to provide whites only and colored seating, dining, and sleeping arrangements, and to see that the races were kept separate. And this applied to the station houses as well as to the train cars. Now, where did the blacks go? Well, they had to be outside. Yeah. Any other questions? Any from the Zoom audience?
Two from the Zoom.
Okay, let's see. When did the train route from Point of Rocks, Brunswick come around? Well, the old main line from Baltimore went to Brunswick. So when the Metropolitan branch joined the old main line at Point of Rocks, then it went to Brunswick too. Do you know about the single-family train wreck in Kensington in the 1920s or 30s? I'm trying to search my memory, but I do not know. 50s, okay. Yeah, there were a lot of train wrecks. There were a lot of people hit. And like the Cuddy Bridge in Gaithersburg was built because a car full of people being driven by Father Cuddy was hit by a train. So sometimes it takes being hit by a train to get the bridge or the underpass or overpass built. There's still that one, that pesky one down Randolph Road, though. Yes?
Interesting that you keep referring to the main line, this line from Baltimore that went west.
Yes.
And then it deteriorated or something, and they instead made the trains go on this V. Do you have any real, why wouldn't they just kept up the and then still calling it the main line?
Well, the main line was, no one had really built a long railroad like this before. It has a magnificent viaduct, the Thomas Viaduct coming out of Baltimore. But after that, it's very windy. It follows the river. And it couldn't be double tracked because it ran through two tunnels. And they would have to not only widen those tunnels, but raise them up for the new trains, and it was just an impossible task. It was a lot cheaper to just build a new line.
couple people on the Zoom with some fond memories, but there's one person who's asking about, is there any way to get copies of the old schedules from the train? She has some fond memories of her family having trips on the train and wanted to know if she could track that down.
Yes, we have some old schedules of the Metropolitan Branch at the Germantown Historical Society.
And if you don't find what you want there, I'm with the B&O Railroad Historical Society, and I'm sure we can find you what you may need.
Yes, I was going to mention you next. The B&O Railroad Historical Society, they have a wonderful website.
You talked about the B&O line being, work on it started in the 1820s, 1850s, prior to the Civil War, and you mentioned immigrant labor. Was there any enslaved labor used to build the railroad?
Well, the Metropolitan Branch, the original corporation failed, so it was after the Civil War that the Metropolitan Branch we know today was built. And they had so many immigrants, Germans and Irish, when they were first building the old main line, that they didn't really have to use the slave labor, which was rather expensive. You had to rent the slaves from the owners. That's not saying that they didn't, but also they didn't mix well with the Irish and the Germans. Any other questions? Yes?
What about inclement weather? How the snow is removed on the tracks?
Well, if you look at the locomotive, you'll see something on the front of these old locomotives called a cow catcher.
Okay.
Yes. And unless there was a huge avalanche, like what you saw in the Orient Express, then they could usually plow their way through snow.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Any other questions from the room?
Yes, one more.
Can you give some sketch of where the trolleys join, like the commuter trolleys?
Yes, the trolleys would join in Silver Spring and at Rockville and Tacoma Park were the main places where the trolleys would join. And they had, I'll finish with one gruesome story just for you all. So there was a trolley crossing at Silver Spring Station across Georgia Avenue, and they had a flagman who would flag down the trolley to stop it because trolleys could stop quicker than trains. So he was he flagged down the trolley. The train was coming from one direction. He stepped back, and the sound of that train going by masked the sound of a train coming the other direction. And so that train hit him and took him all the way to Point of Rocks. It was an express, so yeah, the locomotive didn't see it, the conductor didn't see him because he was so close to the front.
Okay,
Yeah.
one question maybe that will lift us a little bit. Are any of the train stations, do any of the train stations have attendants other than Kensington, which has an informal attendant every evening, who's here tonight? But do any of them actually have an attendant?
No,
No.
None.
absolutely not.
Yep.
All machines.
All machines is the
Yep.
All right, well, thank you so much. Let's please show our appreciation.